Slavery, in one way or the other, has been with man since time immemorial. And for that reason, we had an idea of slavery in Ghana before the foreigners arrived. But how slavery was structured in our culture was not the same as introduced by the foreigners. The person who was a slave was seen as a servant. This person, in most cases, had rights. This person could get married, raise free children, acquire property, and became a free person after paying off his or her debt. It was actually very difficult to identify a slave from a free man because he or she was sheltered, clothed, and fed. Another uniqueness of the idea of slaves in our culture was that a slave could become a royal. When a slave proved to have managerial abilities or military skill, this fellow could become the caretaker of his master's household, and the descendants of such were royals. When a slave woman married into the system, they ceased to be slaves and then had royal descendants. There were three basic ways one could become a slave. One, if you were a prisoner of war, if one was convicted of certain offenses, or as a pawn given out for payments of debt. This was the concept of slavery before the Portuguese came to Ghana in 1471 with the supposed intention to barter trade. I will explain why I say supposed intention to trade in a few. One thing the Portuguese wanted was gold, and the rate at which the locals were given the gold gave the Portuguese the impression that the town was in abundance of it. So they called the place Da Mina, meaning the mine. Because the locals could not pronounce Da Mina properly, the name morphed into Elmina. The original name, however, before the Portuguese arrived was Anom Ansa, meaning inexhaustible water. What we should realize is the Portuguese were taking Africans as slaves from West Africa long before they came to Ghana in 1471. The first time was in 1441, led by Antonio Gonzalez from a place they call Rio de Oro, River of Gold. The 12 slaves taken was to serve as proof or evidence that they had been to West Africa. Upon arrival to Portugal, the prince was excited for two reasons. One, they could educate the slaves and then they would serve as interpreters when they came to trade in Africa. And two, they could be trained as missionaries to spread Christianity. But they never came back as intended or planned. And from 1441, no European came to West Africa without taking captives. So slaves were being captured 30 years before they got to Anomansa, Elmina, in 1471. 11 years later, the Elmina castle itself was built. That is why I said they supposedly came to barter trade in gold and ivory, but they also came for human trade because long before the castles was built, they were already trafficking slaves. It was suggested that the slaves that were taken was a favor to us because they were helping us become Christians, thereby saving our souls from going to hell. Everything changed when the Spaniards got to what they call the New World. Upon getting to the New World, gold and silver mines were opened, sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations were established. But as much as they wanted the world, they were not prepared to do the hard work, so they subjected the natives to do the hard labor. Espanola brutality, overwork, and the effect of European diseases decimated the indigenous population and were near extinction. Bartolomeo de las Casas, a Catholic missionary, had sympathy on the natives and suggested that the blacks taken from Africa be used because in his opinion they were stronger and doing similar work in the same climatic conditions. So about 50 to 250 blacks were taken from Spain to Hispaniola where they were tried, and true to Bartolomeo de las Casas' claim, they proved physically strong, which made the demand for Africans rise. And this began the unfortunate story of misery and pain, the story of the forced exodus of Africans and blacks from their motherland to the world's unknown, what we call the Transatlantic slave trade. There are about 16 preserved forts and 3 castles in Ghana. 40 of these structures was built by the Europeans in West Africa. Out of the 40, about 30 of these structures were built in Ghana, mainly because of our gold. The Amaah Castle is the oldest structure in West Africa, built by the Portuguese around 1482. It is the biggest, oldest, and largest castle in Ghana. The second, which is in Accra, the Christianborg Castle in Osu, was built by the Danes in 1662. The third, Cape Coast Castle, built by the British in 1665. These castles and forts were all built as slave posts, where our forefathers were bought as slaves. The Europeans started getting slaves by raiding and kidnapping, but later some of our chiefs, traditional rulers, and prominent personalities also became suppliers of slaves. The middlemen doing these transactions brought prisoners of war from tribal ethnic conflicts, heavy debtors, criminals, and orphans to trade. So we can not only put the blame on the Europeans, some of our own people also participated. Those captured were marched in chains and shackles from wherever they got them from in West Africa. Those captured from the northeastern part of Ghana would make a stop about 33 miles west from where the slave ships were docked, called as Sin Manso. There they shaved their heads and underarms. They took their first bath after their capture, which also was their last bath on the continent, in the Donko Insuo, meaning slave river. They were smeared with shea butter or palm oil, so those who were older would look younger for high purchase prices. They were brought to where they called the palaver to be examined by doctors to determine their strength, after which they were exchanged for guns, gunpowder, and tobacco, obviously according to their strength. They were then shipped to North America, South America, and the Caribbean to work. Few were sent to Europe, actually. The Cape Coast Castle had 5 male dungeons, and each chamber held about 200 men. An estimated 30% died in the dungeons because of heat, hunger, contagious diseases, etc. Because they were eaten and defecated in these same dungeons they slept in. Those who came just after a ship had set sail had some space to lay down and get some rest on the floor. But when these dungeons were at capacity, they would sleep standing up. Some did this for a day to up to 3 months, depending on when you got to the slave castles. If the time you were brought, there were ships docked and loading, you were sent straight to the ships. If not, there was up to 3 months of waiting. During peak season, ships came every 2 weeks. Because business was very profitable, some of the European countries fought amongst themselves over the coastal lands. The land the Cape Coast Castle sits on changed hands several times, from the Portuguese, then Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, and then Britain. The West Africa coastline became the front of the Anglo-Dutch Wars between the English and the Dutch from 1664 to 1668. The English renamed New Amsterdam to New York when the Dutch fell to them. The Dutch retaliated a year later by taking what the British called Fort York in Cape Coast and renamed it Fort Amsterdam. During the wars, raids, and kidnapping, most died. En route to the castle, wild animals attacked some. Those who became weak or sick en route, the guards killed. Some committed suicide so not to go to unknown destinations to suffer. They jumped overboard from the canoes that brought them to the main ships. And since they were shackled in groups of 20s, when one person jumps overboard, the rest are dragged along. Those who died on the voyage to the Americas and Caribbeans were dumped into the high seas. Those found pregnant were likewise dumped overboard, sometimes alive. When the ships got too heavy due to overload, they dumped slaves off board as well. The worst leg of the journey was the Middle Passage, where humans were laid side by side, unable to move or sit up, hands and legs in chains and shackles. humans defecating and vomiting, and could not even get their own hands to clean their mouth. It was not unusual to wake up to find the person chained next to you dead, and sometimes decomposing. Olaudah Ekweno, an Igbo slave captive, writes about his experience, and I'd want to read it. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror, which I am yet at a loss to describe, nor the then feelings of my mind. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that, with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element the first time I saw it. Yet, nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side. But I could not, and besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. I had never seen among any people such instance of brutal cruelty, and this not only shown towards us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. One white man in particular I saw, when we were permitted to be on deck, flogged so unmercifully with a large rope near the foremast that he died in consequence of it, and they tossed him over the side as they would have done a brute. This made me fear these people the more, and I expected nothing less than to be treated in the same manner. In the Journal of Richard Drake, he writes, "On the 8th day at sea, I took my round of the half deck, holding a camphor bag in my teeth, for the stench was hideous. The sick and the dying were chained together. I saw pregnant women give birth to babies whilst chained to corpses, which our drunken overseers had not removed. The blacks were literally jammed between decks as if in a coffin, and a coffin to that dreadful hold became, to nearly 1/2 of our cargo, before we reached port in Brazil." This was how horrendous it was going through the Middle Passage, not mentioning what happened when they got to the other side where they were enslaved. Progressively in the life of a captive, it only got worse. Statistics show that about 60 million were enslaved during the 400-year period of slave business. Out of the 60 million, only 12 million made the voyage across the Atlantic. Do the math. About 48 million perished. Compare that to the population of Ghana, which is about 27-28 million. These slave ships, called floating coffins, had ironic names like Jesus, Hope, Liberty, Brotherhood, Santa Maria, God is Able, Glory of Africa. The Methodist Church started from the courtyard of the Cape Coast Castle. The Catholic Church started from the Elmina Castle. The Presbyterian Church started from the Christiansborg Castle in Accra. The First Church of England, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG Church, is now the Anglican Church. This First Church of England, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG Church, was built on top of the male dungeons. At the Elmina Castle, the Dutch had their church above the female dungeons. Look at this picture. Whilst they were upstairs in their churches, worshiping, praising, teaching, love your neighbor as yourself, Slaves were in the dungeons right beneath them, crying, hungry, suffering, and dying. Heaven was above, and hell was literally below. In 1833, the entrance that led from the tunnel to the door of no return was sealed off because the British passed the law to abolish slave trade in their territories. The closure of the entrance was to signify the abolishment of the slave trade. Slave trade, meaning the selling and buying of slaves. It was not to abolish slavery. No, slavery was not abolished. The trade was abolished. The billions of people in territories that became the human slab on which the foundation of the Industrial Revolution was laid are now called Third World. Despite our sweat and blood, we were not allowed to participate or benefit from the Industrial Revolution. We rather became the victims of oppression through subjugation and slavery. After being ripped of our natural resources and wealth, we were left without the tools, skills, and machinery necessary to compete in this highly industrialized and technically driven world of the 21st century. The greatest impact has not been the physical restrictions imposed on us, but the horrific mental damage inflicted on our self-concept, self-worth, and self-esteem. Oh yes, there is still a third world in America.